Hey, it's Jennifer here from Belladonna's Botanicals, and I'm bringing you another episode in my series on spiritual awakening. And in this video, we are going to talk about the Abyssal Triad. And for me, that is the crossing the abyss, the dark night of the soul, and EgoDeath. So this is probably gonna be a fairly long video, so feel free to watch this in the background. I'm happy I just got like a new setup here. So I got some new lighting. I got a fancy microphone. So get comfortable and we're going to talk about some of these great topics in your spiritual awakening process. And I actually made an outline and some more extensive notes because there's a lot in these three topics. I've initially thought about making 3 separate videos, but they're so interrelated. There'll be like 3 fairly long redundant videos. I'm just going to do this all as one. You'll probably see my cats running around in the background. And this is my workspace where all of the magic happens. Well, some of the magic, because I do have a ritual space otherwise. So anyways, without further ado, let's get started on this. So the concepts of the abyss, crossing the abyss, EgoDeath, and the dark night of the soul are all interrelated and have very different contextual emphasis, whether viewed through an occult lens, through Aleister Crowley and Thelema, whether you're looking at it through a Jungian psychoanalytical lens, because that figures in very heavily with this, looking at it through all the different concepts and processes that come up in the spiritual awakening process, and other modalities, whether you're looking at it through a Qabbalistic or Qlippothic type of practice or studies around that as well. So, okay, that's a little quick introduction. What does this all mean, and how do you know if you've even scratched the surface on all 3? Simply put, you won't know until you really know. And that's the best way I can describe it. It's having been through these myself. You don't know until you know. Anywho, all these concepts are really are more metaphorical in that one thing symbolizes another. For example, looking at how metaphor works, because sometimes people take things very literally when really it's more metaphorical. And I do have a video here, I think it's under Jennifer's Insights, on metaphorical versus figurative versus literal. So when we're talking about metaphorical, it's more symbolic. So that's what these things are when we're talking about crossing the abyss, when we're talking about EgoDeath, when we're talking about the dark night of the soul. And, they can, in some sense, be literal. I've had some very literal dark nights of the soul experiences, but we'll get to that when we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So, metaphors and symbolism can be subjective based on the person's knowledge and lived experiences. I didn't know I crossed the abyss after a near 3-decade dark night of the soul upon experiencing the EgoDeath and coming out the other side. Once again, once you know, you know. So I'm also going to put the video link to the metaphorical video down here as well. So if you feel like watching that, because I do kind of go into that a little bit more with some examples in occultism, how that is interpreted. So let's explore the Abyssal Triad as it pertains to spiritual awakening. This is all part of the endgame structure of enlightenment, but an important one to prepare for so that you know what to expect and how to identify whether or not you have, in fact, crossed the abyss. So, in my abyssal workings, and Corey is singing in the background, he probably will present us with a mouse toy at some point. So anyways, back to the abyss. I always thought of the concept of the abyss as symbolic or metaphorical death and rebirth process via a spiritual journey and life experiences, because they're not mutually exclusive. Crossing the abyss represents a journey inward and outward, and not one that can be forced through meditation, ritual, etc. Now, there are plenty of those out there that talk about it, but I think it's a much lengthier process. Like, I can't imagine being like, look, I did a ritual, I crossed the abyss. No, you probably didn't. It's a process. This is a process that may take months, it may take years, it may take decades, or even multiple incarnations to really legitimately have crossed the abyss. So now, when we talk about the abyss in this liminal space, what does it look like? Well, again, these are subjective. They're going to be symbolic. They're going to be based upon your perception, knowledge base, your visual vocabulary. Now, not all people who have aphantasia aren't good at like visualizing inside their head. I'm a little too good at it, so sometimes it can be. Results may vary, as I like to say. So to me, the abyss is kind of soupy, like a big reservoir with shores, but black, and beneath is a bit of a garbage dump, and it's gooey and slimy, and sometimes very orange underneath, full of like random objects, lost souls, and other detritus remains. So structurally, the abyss feels like an hourglass without the passage of time or gravitational pull to shift through the sands of time. So the base of the hourglass, the bottom part, would be formed from a lake of blood, which I experienced through early workings with Lilith a few years ago. Then when you get to that sort of narrow connector part is how you can get from that lake of blood to the abyssal reservoir and shores. So I've worked with Abaddon primarily in my abyssal workings, though I have also worked with Santa Muerte, Lilith, and a few more of the dark goddesses and demonic divine over the past few years. But the abyss is something that you can be doing. You could be crossing the abyss and doing abyssal workings and have no freaking clue that that's what you're doing. So a lot of this, I'm going to kind of just pause on this. A lot of this goes back to the journey of it. When I first started working with Belial, one of the things, he said was like, most people who come to me are not as far into the journey as you are. I had already had 10 plus years of like intense ongoing, psychiatric care and psychotherapy and a lot of other treatments. So by the time I made it there, he was like, yeah, you've already been doing this work. So it was just building upon that. So that's kind of the precursor to how I accelerated through some of the abyssal workings. So the abyss is where everything you are and aren't is sort of destroyed and reconstituted. And so the only thing that's left is, as I can only describe it as everything everywhere all at once and nothing at the same time. It's healing, but remembering your journey and the battle scars that you received along the way to this new self. It is wholeness, being whole, just being. And that is one of the most profound states I've experienced in my 48 years on this planet. So, there are some people that do think that as long as you're trying to cross the abyss, you probably never will. It's one of those ineffable things that happens when it happens. There aren't signs and signals because it will be different for everyone. Your abyssal journey might take a few months. It might take a lifetime. It might take several incarnations to really accurately cross the abyss, as it were. So, that's something you need to take into account. Now, obviously, getting into there are different rituals and whether you do meditation, whether you do visionary work or psychedelics work, plant medicine, there are ways that you can kind of facilitate some aspects of it. But again, I don't think it's going to happen until it happens. So just to give you a little bit of other perspectives on the abyss, as it were. So it's generally thought of to be the void that was left when Thoth disappeared as part of the fall of Adam. So what we talk about in modern occultism of crossing the abyss is a term or expression that was coined by Aleister Crowley. And it gets thrown a lot around in the sphere and stuff. So before Crowley, nobody really thought it was possible to, even in a metaphorical sense, cross the abyss. So, and some occult scholars even contend that it's not possible and very unlikely And even if you think you crossed the abyss and did all the rituals surrounding crossing the abyss, that you did not, in fact, actually cross the abyss. It may end up being a cycle of perpetual motion that never reaches completion whilst alive. Maybe the final stage of crossing the abyss is your final breath, which would also make sense. But I don't think that it's completely impossible. I think it's a lot more work than people will probably be willing to do or willing to acknowledge. Are you going to take on a 30-year endeavor right now? It's some of these things I started so long ago in my life, and we'll get to that and when I get into how I crossed the abyss. So, in a Kabbalistic and Qlippothic sense, as we cross the abyss, we're entering into a liminal space where we're dealing ourselves as a part of the all, if you want to call it that. It's broken down in that sense, and I have not worked either the Tree of Life or the Tree of Death yet. I'm familiar enough with it that I can talk about it a little, but it's on my to-do list at some point. I can only do so much. Running the business takes up a lot of time. The fact that, it is almost midnight, so I'm now sitting down to record videos. I've been writing the script for this off and on since yesterday. So going back to the Tree of Life, Tree of Death aspects, is that this is broken down into 3 parts. So you have the you as you are now in this incarnation. The middle part, so that's the lower part. The middle part is your reincarnated soul. And then the upper part is your God self or your higher self in that sense. So that's just to give you a little bit of some foundational rubric. This is the TLDR Cliff Notes version of the abyss. So, and I think it's going to be something, again, that's kind of subjective, that, the abyss to you might be a different abyss than my abyss. So, how did I cross the abyss? So in the series, I'm talking about the whole process of spiritual awakening, and it can be a very lengthy process. And so for me, my spiritual awakening process started around 1991. At present recording in 2023, that's about 32 years ago. I was going to say 22, but I missed a whole decade there, apparently. So that's kind of where I started, really in that time frame. And having gone back through and read all my old journals from back then, I can and I was 15, we were 15, 16 at the time. So I can see the entire process of how that awakening began for me. So there was the first part of it. With the catalyst for me was having been in Catholic school and kind of been like, yeah, this is some BS, and I'm going to find something that works for me. That was sort of the first part. In 1992, some of like the traumatic aspects that come into with the dark night of the soul, and with the process of things that kind of are catalysts in your spiritual awakening. I lost 2 friends to suicide within 2 weeks of each other, 2.5 weeks of each other. Not that half of a week makes much of a difference, but I was 16, so it was very impactful upon me, especially doubly so, and further pushed me away from the Catholic Church was the priests being like, well, it's basically like, it's sad that they died and whatnot, but rest assured, and sad that they went through so much abuse and this was their only way out, but rest assured they're rotting in hell because suicide's a mortal sin. So, you know how I probably feel about that. So, again, that further created that divide that pushed me away from the spiritual origins that I had in Catholicism. And as I've mentioned in other videos, originally I was born into the Byzantine Catholic rite. My family converted to Roman Catholicism when I was about 6. So they're very lazy about it. So anyways, so the abyss is part of the human consciousness. And our life stories form our crossings. We may be working intentionally at times, and sometimes it can happen naturally or at least via unconscious motivations. My abyss was the darkness. And what was interesting about this as I was writing the script, and I had to actually go fact check this for myself because I wasn't familiar with it, is and I talk about this. I'm going to link the videos below in the Trauma Healing and Recovering Memories, Abyssal Workings with Abaddon and Santa Muerte, and Lilith and the Final Boss Fight, the whole process. So those 2 videos in and of themselves are over an hour. So, but so some of this kind of relates to those. So if you want the backstory, you can watch those videos as well. But in this, I went on to say, is my Coronazon was the 1995 parts of myself, the destroyer and the darkness. It was a feral version of my early trauma 19-year-old self. This part came from the first major depressive episode I had, outside of some teen melodrama and the previous self-unalivings that I mentioned earlier, which probably will get, I'm like, I mentioned about a word that'll probably get me shadow banned, so this video will probably get 2 watches. So anyways, this first part came from that. And it was locked away because part of me blamed that version of myself for all the trauma and misery that came after it. Because that was the version of me that dropped out of college. That was the version of me that moved back home. That's the version of me that got into an abusive relationship, and so on and so forth. And all those things that unraveled around that were there's a lot of, like, one of the things I had been doing, in addition to, like, you know, I talk a lot about the different types of psychological treatments I've done, whether it's like ketamine therapy or microdosing psilocybin. I did a lot of EMDR in addition to regular psychotherapy and stuff like that. But I also was doing a lot of parts work. So this is what I call a part. So it was the darkness or the destroyer. It was a very feral part of me. And that part was locked away in, like, the depths of the abyss. So just to give a little background, Coronazon is the abyssal entity summoned by Aleister Crowley in his infamous crossing of the abyss. It was said that Coronazon can appear as a version of yourself in this process. That was what I was like, okay, I'm on point with this. That sometimes Coronazon doesn't, you know, will mimic you in that sense. So, so for me, my Coronazon was I don't know if I'm saying that right, was the 1995 feral version of myself. It was a thing locked at the bottom of the abyss. Put it this way, Abaddon and Santa Muerte were like, yeah, we're not touching that. And then kind of closed the door. So, and we left that part when we discovered that part, that darkness, that thing that just wanted to destroy the world. We were like, yeah, we're closing that door. We're not sure what to do with that yet. And some of that came through some shadow work and past life regression that I was doing with a colleague, Tila Petrova. But, you know, we left that part locked away until it's spontaneously integrated. And I go over that a little bit more in depth in the videos linked below. Now, this part, I was intentionally working on recovering my lost memories due to the trauma, and to start working towards healing that part, that feral part. You know, I wasn't intending to experience ego death across the abyss. I was like, I just want my good memories back, because the problem was that all the trauma and the way timelines overlapped for me is that it not only took the bad memories, it took the good memories as well. And I have been recovering them pretty steadily since like July. And it's been interesting because they're always so random. But that's a story for another day. So this is what unintentionally, even though I was intentionally doing abyssal workings, this is what unintentionally led to the final stretches of crossing the abyss. Now, mind you, this was a I would say at this point, probably almost a 30-year endeavor. Like my spiritual awakening started in 1991. But I would say the crossing of the abyss probably started around 1995. And hi, it's 2023 now. So that was a hot mess of a long period of time in my life. So I've done a lot of workings in the abyss before. I have fallen into the abyss. I've jumped into the abyss. I've probably been thrown into the abyss. And I learned how to heal and save lost and or damaged soul parts. I have a video on that as well. I've been gutted, opened, and spilled into the abyss and reconstituted. So what I experienced here within this in-depth goes over it in the Abyssal Workings with Abaddon and Santa Muerte, as I described it in that video, is where I literally had been suspended over the abyss. So, and the way I kind of, to give you a visual kind of picture of what this looked like, if you've seen the Hellraiser movies, you know how Pinhead shoots out the chains with the fish hooks at the end and they pull people apart that way. It kind of was like that, but with like energetic cords that kind of split me open and poured me into the abyss, at which point, you know, I kind of was departicleized, I don't know if that's a word, poured into the abyss and kind of through a swirling tornadic vortex reconstituted into myself. But that wasn't the part and parcel, the whole of it, of going, wow, I crossed the abyss now, I'm done. No. I did, however, start to experience a rapid reintegration of that feral part in late July of 2023. Sometimes what happens, I call it the spiritual sleep, where you need to integrate something, or the spirits are like, okay, you're just not paying attention. We're going to push you down and make you sleep so we can, do our things, or, tinker around, whatever. So there was like a 24-hour period of time where I just was unconscious. Well, kind of unconscious, I guess, but trying to think which came first, the chicken or the egg here. I think the spiritual sleep may have come first. And then that led to the Lilith and the final boss fight. And that is at the point at which I experienced the ego death. And, it was, again, in the video, I go over it very in depth. It's a very long, drawn out process and story, but I'm going to kind of give you the Cliff Note version of it, in that, Lilith kind of was like, all right, choose the form of your final destroyer, and which was Kali Ma, and she came and kind of absorbed me into herself. And there was this experience for me, the ego death of it, where it was like, it's a state of being without motivation, existing beyond the constructs of ego, subconscious, unconscious, id, in a psychoanalytical sense. You're just in a state of being. There is no mind. There is no motivation. There is nothing at that point, but you just see and experience, and the attachment to your body, to the world, to everything is gone. And you kind of become the ego observer or the observing ego, I think is the right expression for that. If I remember correctly, I remember when my therapist talked about that a lot. So to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what ego death is and how it fits into this equation, is that it's a complete loss of the subjective self-identity. So who I am as a person just kind of went away. That I was just a being of like vibration, frequency, and energy. That and I'm just kind of breaking it down to rudimentary fundamentals at that point. Now, in terms of Carl Jung also used the term, I think he used the term psychic death, referring to this as well. So some of this does fit into Jungian psychology or psychoanalysis and stuff. I actually studied a lot of theory around Jungian stuff, and that I took a lot of, because I have a degree in art history, so I had to take a lot of theory, criticism, aesthetics, philosophy classes. I don't know that I spent a lot of time on Carl Jung, but I focused a lot on the work that came after. So like Jacques Lacan came out of the Jungian thing. So a lot of it, I went into sort of the neo-Lacanian and deconstructionist sort of philosophical models. So that's one aspect. And also the ego death figures into the Fool's Journey motif from Joseph Campbell as well. And it's really just a state of existential being where you're just completely detached from the ego of the self. And deconstructing that ego in the process of crossing the abyss, gives that it's part of that process. They can happen together or they can happen separately. And I think you can probably experience multiple ego deaths at that point. So ego loss and or death can be experienced in a sense through psychedelics and using that like hallucinogenic plant medicine or chemicals, whether it's like ketamine or DMT, ayahuasca, psilocybin, LSD. I'm not sure really if it denotes a true ego death, but that's probably subjective. Because for some people it might. So in my experiences doing, especially on the psychedelic medicine side and plant medicine side of things, I felt a sense of depersonalization, dissociation, ego loss, but not ego death in the sense of the way I experienced in the Abyssal workings with Abaddon and the Lilith final boss fight. So it's kind of like, it's just like I was saying before, it's a state of being without motivation, existing beyond those psychoanalytical constructs. Once you experience ego death, like you can truly live and ascend through the spiritual awakening process. I'm just going to give you a little warning here. The world comes infinitely more annoying once you do. So what's the post-ego death experience like? Well, it's not that the ego is completely obliterated permanently. It just becomes much easier to distinguish ego-driven behavior, thoughts, and actions. And that's where you're just kind of like find yourself eye-rolling literally everything. Where you're just like, wow. So am I the only one seeing this? Okay. So it gives you a better perspective of things. And when you can really look at things and go, that's just human ego. Like, okay, to use an example of how this changed my perspective on things very, very quickly and dramatically. Like I look at things like human ego thinks we own the land and that we have birthrights to the land that we live on and stuff. I kind of have the feeling that the land just doesn't give a shit about that. And long after we're gone, the way of the dinosaurs, do you think that the earth is going to be like, no, this land belonged to so-and-so and whatnot. And that was their birthright. The land. And you can have amazing working energy with the land spirits and, the plant life and flora and fauna of that area. But it's sorry. I just got my hair done the other day and I got these little tinsel things. And there was one that was just like dangling weird. Anywho. So you can have a great relationship with the land, but the land kind of owns itself, as do the plants. So you can claim all the firstisms you want in the world and birthright and whatnot. That is 100% purely human ego. I'm not talking about it from any moral or ethical or sociopolitical sense. I'm talking about it from a purely ego-driven motivation sense. That's just an example of it. So, as I'm saying, the world becomes infinitely more stupid when post ego death, where you're just like, oh my God, how am I the only one seeing this? How is not ever? What? I feel like, the past 6 months have been going, what is this fuck shit? What the hell's going on? What's wrong with people? Anywho. Maybe this video won't be as long as I thought it was going to be. Anyways, so we'll talk a little bit about the dark night of the soul in the context of crossing the abyss and ego death. So the origin of the expression comes from a 16th century poem from St. John of the Cross. And the dark side of the soul it's a timeless phase, like a spiritual awakening, like crossing the abyss. It can last varying lengths of time. I would say I went through a 27-year-long dark night of the soul and just kind of finally came out the other side. It can be the part in which you're crossing the abyss at the most difficult, treacherous parts. And, the expression is very colloquially used, meaning a crisis of faith, an existential crisis, an extremely difficult phase or transition in one's life. So additionally, it can also represent the darkest parts of the self, introspection, examination, and healing processes as well. I just had a whole lot of shit that, made my dark night a very long dark night. So these things do not have a timetable on them. So when you're experiencing the dark night of the soul, and believe me, that's not something I wish upon anyone. Were they all dark nights in that 27 years? No, but the whole process took that long. So like the amount of healing I have experienced in the past almost 4 years now is more than the previous 20 some total. So, the dark night of the soul, that is just like abject despair, like the deepest, darkest despair, not knowing what's going on, if you're going to make it out alive, or with your sanity intact. So, these are all very intense things. And I know this is more of an advanced topic in the Spiritual Awakening series, but I wanted to put it more in the beginning because I think it's valuable to talk about this, to know what to expect, to know if you have truly crossed the abyss, to know that it may not happen overnight. We're talking decades here for me. And it's not consistent work. It can be, unintentional. It can be spontaneous. It can be intentional, or a combination thereof. Probably the most likely will be a combination thereof. So to sort of tie together all of these things. So none of these things can be forced. You can't really force an ego death. You can enhance the experience by using psychedelics. You can do some intentional things, whether it's meditation or ritual or, vision questing kind of work. So you can certainly work towards that goal, but they kind of just happen when they happen. And by that point, you may very well be decades into the process. And, some attempt to achieve the crossing the abyss through, like I said, visionary work, meditation, rituals, these can help, but I honestly don't think it will push you across the abyssal finish line any faster. It's going to happen when it happens. You can't force it. You can try. I don't recommend it. I know Aleister Crowley supposedly did it, but, different times, he was Aleister Crowley, and B, 100 some years, however many 100 years ago, whatever, I don't have time to take like a year and just do nothing but, spiritual work and not have to work and do, my other job, live a life and whatnot. So, that's sort of my thoughts on that. And I would say with all of this is document your experiences. I wish I had done a better job of that myself. Sometimes I'm really good about documenting things, like writing in my journals and stuff like that. And other times I'm like, I will document things. They're just going to be on, the backs of envelopes, random pieces of scrap paper in 20 different journals instead of one. So I would say organize your stuff here. So you can also kind of chart the process. The reason I was able to really go back to my origin story was because I had, a decade's worth of journals from the 1990s to go through. So, yeah, that's how do I feel coming out the other side of all of this? I'm still integrating it, to be honest. It's the experience of feeling whole for the first time in my life has been, I'm not sure what to do with it yet, but I've accelerated through massive changes in my life since then, since I experienced all of this. I mean, I moved out of Philadelphia. I settled into my new place. I'm happy. Apparently, I can be a calm person. I did not know that about myself. I started cooking and baking again, which I haven't done. I even lost 16 pounds so far. So, my life is very different now than it was a year ago or earlier this year or up until the time I moved. I'm an entirely different person than I was. And it changed so rapidly. I mean, I know I've struggled throughout the course of my life, with my weight, with, having healthy eating habits, with, diet and exercise. Well, I go to the gym now. I mean, I don't go like 3 times a week or anything, but I work with a personal trainer and stuff like that. So I'm slowly kind of working out. I mean, I might go a little bit more once I get through the holiday season. Just because the past 2 months have been kind of crazy with trying to settle in, unpack everything, get the business up and running. Then I went straight into holiday stuff. So, yeah. So what do I want to tell you additionally about crossing the abyss? It's I'm just gonna reiterate, it's gonna happen when it happens. It may never happen. It depends, but some people do cross the abyss, some don't. Some think they do, surely, but it's after you cross the abyss, you'll know. You'll really, really know. If you cross the abyss and nothing in your life changes, you probably haven't crossed the abyss. If you cross the abyss and everything in your life changes, you've probably crossed the actual abyss. So, anyways, this is another video in my spiritual awakening series. I'm really excited about this. I have so many more videos to bring you. I'm trying to record at least one a week. On different topics, and I'm probably still 30 some deep at this point. Some of them are taking a little bit more time of research and kind of collecting my thoughts on it, but don't forget to click like and subscribe. Be sure to subscribe to our e-newsletter and our social media, because YouTube's a bit broken with notifications and whatnot, and that's the best way to keep an eye on what's going on with us. And I always push out, links to our new videos on social media. They're in our weekly e-newsletter and whatnot. So anyways, thank y'all. Love you. Talk to you soon. Bye.